If I say the word desert, I bet you think of dunes, sand, maybe a few scraggly bushes clinging to rocky soil, and heat, definitely heat. But that isn't the only kind of desert that exists in our world today. What I want to explore in today's episode is the importance of cold deserts in a fantasy world and how you can use them to make your world's biomes richer and more challenging for the people or creatures who live in them. Welcome to another episode of World Building Biomes from Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. So, the first thing to establish is what exactly a cold desert actually is. Cold deserts, like the one in Antarctica or the one in the Arctic and the high altitude regions such as the Tibetan Plateau, are defined by extremely low temperatures, minimal precipitation, and the precipitation that does fall is generally snow, and salty soils and extreme winds. Unlike hot deserts, their dryness comes from frozen water and atmospheric patterns, not heat. Life in these frozen deserts has evolved with stunning and sometimes pretty bizarre adaptations. We'll get into the life forms, both plant and animal, in a little bit. But first, let's make sure we understand the key characteristics of a cold desert. First, annual precipitation must be below 25 centimeters, and as I said, it's mostly snow. Second, temperatures often drop below minus 40 Celsius in winter, and that's actually also minus 40 in Fahrenheit, because minus 40 Celsius and minus 40 Fahrenheit are where the two temperature scales meet over a cold cup of coffee. Third, the soil of cold deserts is salty, nutrient poor, and often bound by permafrost, meaning the ground itself is permanently frozen. You're not digging into it without enormous effort, because even in summer, the ground stays frozen. The surface of a cold desert is usually ice, snow, gravel plains, and sometimes even bare rock. And light conditions in cold deserts generally fall under Arctic or Antarctic patterns. And that means that you get extreme polar day-night cycles. In winter, you can have 3 to 6 months of darkness, and in summer, 3 to 6 months of sunlight, depending on how far you are in the Arctic Circle or down in the Southern Circle. And let me tell you, as somebody who lives very far north in Finland, it is insane to have that much light and darkness. And it's really hard to grow anything in that kind of environment. Even here in in the relatively southern portion of the country where I live in southern Finland, we experience a very short growing season. And while our summers are glorious, I mean, look at it. Just look at it, right? And I love being outside in the long summer days. In winter, we don't get enough light to grow an olive tree. An olive tree needs 6 hours of sunlight a day. And even on sunny winter days, we only get about 3 hours. And that's in the south. Okay, so light definitely has a huge impact on cold deserts. But let's talk about wind. Cold deserts, especially places like Antarctica, often experience katabatic winds. These are winds that can reach hurricane speeds. Katabatic winds happen when cold, dense air travels down from the mountains, rushing over the land and striking the ocean. This is caused by the extreme cold creating high pressure systems that drive the winds to blow at incredible speeds. And these fierce winds make conditions very poor for the formation of precipitation bearing clouds. Basically, the clouds get busted up and blown away before they can drop any snow or rain or anything else. Okay, so those are the key characteristics of a cold desert. And if you learned something new in this section, hit the thumbs up button. And let's dive into what kind of flora could and do live in the cold deserts. The flora or plant life of cold deserts is incredibly sparse and incredibly hardy. In Antarctica's fell fields and the Arctic tundra, vascular plants are super rare or even completely absent. Instead, their place is taken by cryptogams, non-vascular plants like mosses, lichens, and algae. These plants have some really specific and pretty remarkable adaptations that allow them to survive in this very hostile environment. So first, let's talk about the problem with the light and how these plants actually survive going into the polar night where they might not see sunlight for months. Plants in cold desert conditions have photoinhibition resistance. So, during the long dark winter, these organisms are exposed to extreme cold and total darkness, followed by sudden intense light when the polar spring arrives. And because of that, they've developed a resistance to photoinhibition, which allows them to restart photosynthesis very effectively when the light returns without damaging their cellular machinery. They've also developed the ability to go into metabolic shutdown or dormancy. Many mosses and lichens go into complete dormancy during the polar night. They stop photosynthesizing, they halt their metabolism, and they essentially pause their life processes. This lets them endure without the energy inputs that plants in sunnier regions rely on. Another key adaptation is high desiccation tolerance. Mosses and lichens and similar organisms can dry out or desiccate completely and still remain viable for months or even years. When light, water, and warmth return, they rehydrate and reactivate. This is similar to desert plants that we've talked about before in my video on hot deserts, which you can check out in the information card. But here, it's not drought causing the desiccation, it's freezing that pushes these plants into dormancy. Now, here's a fascinating thing that I did not know until I started researching cold deserts. Some species of flora produce sugar alcohols or specialized proteins that act like antifreeze, preventing ice crystals from forming inside their cells. This is a pretty key survival mechanism during the brutal winters because they literally keep the ice out, flowing antifreeze through their insides. But when summer returns, you do also need to consider the effect of those very long summer days in terms of light. Both Arctic and Antarctic lichens have specialized pigments like carotenoids and peritin that not only help with photosynthesis but also act as UV screens. After months of darkness, the sudden return of extreme ultraviolet radiation during the spring melt can be deadly, but these pigments shield the cells from harm. Another important aspect of flora surviving the harsh, cold desert environment is microclimates. Microclimates are formed in rock crevices, little sheltered microhabitats where the temperature is more stable. Even a very small crevice can offer protection. Snow can insulate it from the cold, and winds don't plunge directly into the crevice. And in these tiny spaces, relict plants and mosses can survive while the open ground is completely uninhabitable. There's also something amazing called endolithic life. Some algae and cyanobacteria live literally inside rocks, especially translucent rocks like quartz, which let in enough light for photosynthesis while protecting the flora from UV, wind, and extreme temperature swings. Another form of life, which I'm covering here under flora, is bacteria and archaea, which live under the ice. Many bacteria and archaea thrive under the Antarctic ice sheets, permafrost, and salty soils. These are called psychrophiles, or cold-loving organisms. They have enzymes and membrane structures specifically adapted to function at sub-zero temperatures. Their cellular machinery remains flexible, not rigid, even in the extreme cold. These microbes often live in tiny little brine pockets within the ice, where salt depresses the freezing point, and this creates little liquid environments that they can continue to survive in. They continue very low level metabolic activity even when the surface conditions are lethal to other forms of life. And the last type of life I want to highlight in the flora world is how in harsh environment microbes can form biofilms, sticky communities that trap nutrients, retain moisture, and provide communal protection against environmental stresses, including radiation and salinity. They literally band together so more of them can survive by creating this biofilm of microbes. Okay, so that's all the kind of flora, but why is any of this fascinating to you as a fantasy world builder? Well, even if you don't want to go exploring the cold deserts of your world, there are things you can draw from this. You can have mosses that store energy or information across centuries, maybe as a resource for your magic system. Or you can have a microbial ecosystem under a frozen ocean supporting some kind of ancient entity or spirit. Or think about that endolithic life thing that I mentioned. Tiny organisms living inside rocks. Think if that was some kind of sentient life form that had developed the capacity to communicate beyond the rock they inhabit. Or what if they were able to even move the rock, like they can wear the rock like armor and just stride through life, these little endolithic pieces of life living inside quartz and, walking across the landscape. I find that incredibly intriguing. It would be super freaking cool. So, in general, the flora in a cold desert is really weird, and that gives us lots of great ideas to build general flora with, but also it gives us a great starting point for building the flora of a cold desert in our fantasy world. Before we launch into the fauna, give me a second to invite you to sign up for my newsletter. It comes out 4 times a year, and it's not just a summary of all the videos I publish. It contains my deeper thoughts on world building, answers to questions that you ask, and updates on my own work, as well as summaries of interesting videos that I've made or that I've watched. So if you want more world building, and to make sure that you have contact with me outside of the YouTube platform, sign up on the link down below. Alrighty, onward with cold desert fauna. The animals that exist north and south in the cold deserts are quite different in some ways. In the south, in the Antarctic, we famously have penguins like the Adélie and the emperor penguin. They have dense, overlapping feathers coated in oil for waterproofing and insulation. Emperor penguins huddle together in giant shifting groups, which reduces heat loss by up to 50% by this behavior of huddling. More on that later. The male emperor penguin incubates the eggs the female produces by holding the eggs on his feet and covering it with a flap of his belly, which I think is just such a cool incubation method. Like you literally carry the eggs, on your feet and cover them. It's awesome. Anyway, other Antarctic life includes seals such as the Weddell, the Ross, and leopard seals, and they rely on their thick blubber for insulation and can hold their breaths for long periods while diving under the ice to hunt for food. And then, of course, you have all of the more oceanic life, like orcas, which can hunt penguins on the ice and seals in the water or on land, as long as they're reasonably near the edge. And krill, which are tiny shrimp-like crustaceans that form the base of the Antarctic Ocean food chain. Despite the frigid conditions, krill survive under the sea ice by feeding on the algae, And remember that we spoke about the algae that live there. So the krill serve as the main food source for penguins, seals, and even some whales. And then, of course, other whales eat those larger predators, and so on and so forth in your typical food chain. I did do a video on how to use food chains if you want to check that out in the information card. So, a lot of life in the Antarctic has evolved not just for the cold land, or in fact, often not for the land at all, but to partially or fully live in the water like orcas or seals. By contrast, in the Arctic, we have polar bears as the top predators, hunting seals on the sea ice. Polar bear fur is hollow and translucent. It's not actually white. This structure helps trap heat while their skin, which is black, absorbs solar warmth. Arctic foxes have thick insulating fur and compact rounded bodies with short ears and muzzles to minimize the surface area exposed to the cold. And also up here in the north, you have lemmings, small rodents that live under the snow in winter, feeding on vegetation and forming an important food source for predators like snowy owls and foxes. And no, lemmings do not follow each other off a cliff. That is pure freaking fiction that Disney made up. Now, there are types of life that are shared between both the Arctic and the Antarctic, particularly arthropods. In the Antarctic, you have springtails and mites that survive by entering a state of supercooling, where their body fluids stay liquid below freezing thanks to antifreeze proteins in their blood. They also avoid ice nucleators, tiny particles that trigger freezing inside the body. In the Arctic, you find insects like beetles, flies, and mosquitoes that accumulate glycerol and other chiroprotectants in their tissues, lowering the freezing point of their bodily fluids. These adaptations let them survive winter in a dormant, freeze-tolerant, or freeze-avoidant state. Fun fact, up here where I am, we have no mosquitoes in winter. But sadly, they all come roaring back like a giant buzzing pack in summer. Into all life, some rain must fall. Anyway, let's talk about those key adaptations in polar animals that they have evolved for these cold desert conditions. First is like we spoke about the antifreeze proteins. Just like in plants, these are found in fish, insects, and some microorganisms. Antifreeze proteins bind to small ice crystals in the blood, preventing them from growing and damaging cells. This allows animals like the Antarctic ice fish to survive in waters below the freezing point of pure water. Then we have the famous fat reserves and blubber. Marine animals like seals and waves have thick blubber layers that provide both insulation and stored energy, helping them survive fasting periods when there is very little food, for example, during molting or breeding seasons when they stay on the ice or when food is scarce due to the season. Then you also have what is known as Bergmann's rules and Allen's rule. Bergmann's rule states that larger, more compact bodies conserve heat better in cold regions because of the lower surface to area volume. Basically, being thick is good for you in the cold. And then Allen's rule says that shorter extremities, ears, tails, limbs, and so on, reduce heat loss in cold climates. And this is why the Arctic fox is a great example. Small ears, short snout, compact shape, perfect for the Arctic desert. Okay, then there is behavioral adaptations. Remember when we spoke about the emperor penguin and I said that they huddle together and that reduces their heat loss? Well, that is a behavioral strategy. They maximize their warmth by sharing it. Lemmings and Arctic ground squirrels burrow under the snow, creating insulated tunnels. And then you also get seasonal migration in this category. Arctic terns travel from the Arctic to the Antarctic every year. The longest migration of any animal, about 70,000 kilometers in their migration to and fro. And caribou and reindeer also migrate seasonally, moving south when the environment becomes too harsh and food too scarce. So those are all your behavioral adaptations. And then finally, there's marine adaptations. The Southern Ocean around Antarctica stays liquid despite the freezing air temperatures, thanks to its very high salt content. And this is an important thing to understand about water and ocean freezing. Over here where I live, the Baltic Sea freezes solid in winter, solid enough that you can walk on it, you can ski on it, you can even haul granite blocks across it to Estonia, which is what they used to do in the Middle Ages. But that's because the Baltic has a relatively low salt content. In contrast, the Southern Ocean's high salinity keeps it liquid, allowing fish like the Antarctic toothfish and, of course, marine mammals like orcas to survive. Okay, so what can you do with all of this information about these animals in your fantasy world? You could design a race of creatures adapted to super cool their blood, making them nearly impossible to kill with cold magic. They could be highly resistant to elemental attacks. Or you could create a magic system inspired by the antifreeze proteins, where mages can lock or unlock biological stasis and stay in suspended animation for centuries and then come back to life, extending what they can see in their life for perhaps hundreds or thousands of years. You could adapt some of the behaviors, like penguin huddling, to a fantasy race that doesn't just huddle for warmth, but also generates magical power when they're clustered together. Maybe the group's collective energy can be channeled by a central mage, allowing them to heal, power a city, or unleash a massive magical effect. Okay, so that's the fauna of a cold desert. Now, let's just talk pure environment and ecosystem for a few minutes. So first, you should know that there are in fact subglacial rivers, aquifers, and lakes that exist beneath the ice. For example, Lake Vostok in Antarctica is one of the world's largest subglacial lakes. It lies under 4 kilometers of ice, and it's been isolated for over 1 million years and may harbor unique microbial life adapted to total darkness, crushing pressure, and very nutrient limited conditions. Now, imagine in a fantasy world you had such a lake buried under 4 kilometers of ice. What could you put there? What kind of spirit can you trap in the ice? What kind of world ending monster lurks below? Do you have Cthulhu itself buried below the ice? Can you tell I'm an epic fantasy author? I'm an epic fantasy author. I would put Cthulhu down there. Let me know in the comments what you would hide in the ice if you had such a lake in your world. But besides the lakes and deep ice, there could be other purely environmental things that you should consider about building a cold desert environment. First, let's go back to lights briefly and talk about polar lights or auroras. These are going to be extremely common in any cold desert setting during and they'll be visible during the winter stages, but they will be active even in summer, even if people can't see them. And throughout the long winter nights, you will often see aurora simmering across the sky. And the aurora is such an interesting element to include in a magic system. It could be a pathway people travel through, like the Bifrost of Norse mythology. It could be a bridge to other realms. It could be a source of magical power, allowing mages to absorb the energy of magnetic spheres. Or maybe you leverage it as a lifeline for certain plants or animals, helping them survive despite the lack of sunlight. It's also worth thinking about what the actual landscape looks like. The Antarctic dry valleys, for example, are drier than the Atacama Desert because of the katabatic winds. There are even ice-free areas in the Antarctic desert, carved and shaped by those same winds, creating alien deathscapes where life survives only in tiny sheltered microhabitats. It's a stark, brutal environment to try and survive in. So, when you're building a cold desert biome in your fantasy world, remember this is the kind of place where you either have tiny, fragile scraps of life clinging to the world in hidden crevices, or you have life so thick, dense, and hyper adapted that it can only survive here and nowhere else. And its behavior, its culture, or maybe even its magic could be completely unlike anything else found in your world. And that wraps up our exploration of the cold desert. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment down below. And thank you very much to all of my members, especially the just-in-timers of the Build It in Stone level. Neil Buckley, Lupex Lakeshire, Necromancer JM, Epic, Katie Kofi Mug, and Tony Lamanna. You guys make it possible for me to keep making these videos. If you would like to support the channel, one free way you can do that is by simply watching another video, which tells the algorithm that my channel is worth caring about. And if you enjoyed this video about world building biomes, maybe check out my video on world building Arctic conditions themselves, which I'll put on the screen now. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building.